Texas, 1944. The sun dipped low behind the dry hills. Wind moved slow across rusted fences and dry earth. Somewhere behind barbed wire, smoke curled upward from a ranch-style grill. The sound of meat hitting hot iron echoed against the quiet. A handful of American soldiers stood by the fire, flipping thick patties of ground beef. The scent carried through the fence. Grilled fat, toasted bread, pepper, and smoke. On the other side stood German prisoners of war. One of them, thin and sunburned, stared at the tray being carried toward the gate. Burgers, real ones, soft buns, sliced tomato, fresh. Lettuce, melted cheese, a pile of golden fries on the side. He didn't move. Didn't blink. The others whispered behind him in low, sharp German, "It's a trick." No one reached for the food. In Germany, they had eaten boiled turnips, moldy bread, rationed fat. Their families were starving. They had marched and fought for survival. Now in the middle of Texas, the enemy was offering the meat. Not spoiled, not leftover, cooked hot, seasoned, delivered by hand. Back home, they'd been told Americans were savages. Prison meant hunger, punishment, humiliation. No one said anything about beef grilled over mesquite wood at sunset. One of the guards, just a kid from San Antonio, stepped forward and said with a grin, "Come on, you all earned it." Lifted the tray, passed a burger through the fence. The prisoner looked down at it, then up, and did something no one expected. He stepped back, eyes wide, and began to cry. Because war doesn't always break people with gunfire. Sometimes it breaks them with something too kind, too warm, too impossible to understand. A hamburger. In that moment, the myth cracked. The numbers began to unravel. And for one German P, the smell of cooked beef did more damage than months of Allied bombs. They arrived in boxcars, tired, dirty, and defiant. Captured in North Africa, Sicily, or France, stripped of weapons, uniforms faded, boots torn. They carried instead were ideas. Ideas planted by propaganda, sharpened by fear and sealed by pride. That Americans were cruel. That surrender meant humiliation. That captivity was a slow death by labor and starvation. Nazi training camps, young soldiers were shown films of so-called American savagery. They were told U.S. soldiers beat their prisoners, shot escapees without warning, denied medical care, and let hunger do the rest. Captivity was worse than combat, the instructor said. Better to die fighting. But Texas didn't follow the script. The barbed wire came, yes, the guards with rifles, the roll calls. But the days were not filled with beatings. They were filled with work, farm work, ranch work, clearing brush, harvesting cotton, feeding cattle, the same tasks they'd done back home. And then the food, potatoes, milk, beans, bread, sometimes fruit, sometimes meat, and one day, hamburgers. For many of these men, this was not a luxury. It was a contradiction. Could the enemy feed them better than their own army had? How could the nation they were taught to fear offer them rest, warmth, and enough to eat? 1P later wrote, "The first time they served us meat, I looked for the trick. I thought it was poisoned. No one could be that generous to a prisoner." The illusion was breaking. Slowly, meal by meal, job by job, word by translated word. Some guards taught them English phrases. Some ranchers offered old gloves. There were stories of Texans mailing letters for PS, even slipping them extra rations when no one was looking. These weren't acts of treason. They were acts of confusion, kindness that unsettled. The hardest part wasn't the fence or the labor or the war stories. It was the silence in the mind when hatred had no place to sit anymore. When the anger ran out and was replaced by a plate of food and someone saying, "Eat." For some, the hamburger wasn't just unexpected. It was unbearable. Because if the enemy could be kind, what had they fought for? By 1943, America faced a problem most nations had never imagined. What do you do with 400,000 enemy soldiers and nowhere to put them? As the Allies advanced across Europe and North Africa, Axis prisoners began arriving by the thousands. Camps in Europe were full. Ships kept sailing west. So, the U.S. turned to its wide-open spaces. And Texas answered. Texas became one of the largest holders of German PS in the United States, with over 78,000 prisoners housed across more than 30 facilities. From Lockcatch to Herne, Hereford to Mahia, barbed wire fences sprang up across ranch lands, rail yards, and even fairgrounds. These weren't secret prisons. They were guarded, regulated, and governed by the Geneva Convention. But more than that, they were American. Camp Herne, one of the most notable in Texas, held around 4,800 German PS at its peak. It became known among prisoners as the Fritz Ritz, a dark joke about how humane conditions were. The camp had organized soccer games, musical performances, mail systems, even art exhibitions. But it wasn't all leisure. The war still needed bodies, and German PS became a crucial labor force. By law, under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be made to work, but only non-military tasks and never in humane conditions. In Texas, that meant farms and ranches. Labor shortages plagued the rural South, where young American men had gone to war and old men struggled to keep land productive. The solution was pragmatic. Pay German prisoners to pick cotton, haul hay, fix fences. They were paid in script, fake currency to use at camp cantons. It wasn't much, but it gave them coffee, soap, postcards, and cigarettes. And more than that, it gave them rhythm. Each morning, guarded trucks picked up teams of PS and drove them to local farms. One day they were mending fence posts, the next digging irrigation lines. The weather was brutal. The work was real. But it was something familiar, structured, and strangely dignifying. Some Texans, skeptical at first, came to rely on their German workers, and some PSWs came to prefer ranch labor to their lives back home. One rancher in Mlenan County said, "They worked harder than some of my own hands." And they said, "Thank you," in English. Food became central to this strange relationship. The U.S. military provided 3 meals a day, about 2,800 to 3,500 calories depending on assignment. In Germany, by 1944, civilian rations had dropped below 1,500 calories, and meat was a memory. For German prisoners in Texas, a full plate wasn't just nourishment. It was cognitive dissonance. They had been captured expecting misery and were now eating beef, potatoes, and bread under the sun. This contradiction became more powerful than any leaflet. When a ranch family cooked extra cornbread or slipped a few fried pies into the lunch crate, it didn't just fill stomachs. It cracked ideology. Men raised on fear, told that Americans were monsters, now faced something more confusing: compassion. But nowhere was that break more profound than in the moment the hamburgers arrived. Because burgers weren't just food. They were American symbols. Fast, hot, generous, unapologetic. For men who had been through the worst of war, who had seen firebombs destroy cities, who had marched through Russian winters, the real shock wasn't captivity. It was kindness served on a paper plate. In war, numbers don't just measure logistics. They measure belief. They decide whether a man thinks his side can still win or whether he begins to question everything. And for the German prisoners held in Texas, it was the numbers that broke them. By 1944, food in Germany had become a memory. The average civilian was living on town 200 to 1,500 calories a day, and that was in the best conditions. Cities like Berlin and Cologne under constant Allied bombing saw supplies collapse. Ration cards offered little. Dried peas, black bread, ersatz coffee, powdered milk. Meat had vanished. Real sugar was priceless. People boiled cabbage stems for soup, scraped fat off paper wrappings, shared single eggs. Among families, even frontline soldiers weren't spared. Wehrmacht troops in Italy and France reported receiving 1,700 to 1,900 calories daily, barely enough to sustain men marching or under fire. Wounded men recovered slower. Dropped. Internal memos from German command admitted, "We are feeding ghosts." Then came capture, transport, processing, and Texas. In Texas, German PSWs were issued daily rations of 2,800 to 3,500 calories tailored to physical labor. Most were assigned to ranches, cotton fields, or orchard work. That meant protein, starch, vegetables, even desserts. Camp kitchens served thick stews, boiled potatoes, buttered rolls, and most shockingly beef, grilled, sliced, ground into patties. Hamburgers, a food item so quintessentially American, so loud in flavor, so rich in fat and salt that it functioned like a cultural lightning bolt. For men who hadn't seen a real cut of meat in 2 years, it was too much, too good, too symbolic. The Geneva Convention had rules, but it never expected a country to feed prisoners better than it fed civilians. The U.S. followed the rules to the letter, and Texas went further. Ranchers donating excess produce, local bakers supplying bread, even church groups sent pies to the camp. One German wrote in his diary, "I don't understand this place. We eat like kings in a land we came to destroy." The guards saw it too. One wrote home, "If we gave our boys the same plates we give the crows, we'd have riots." But there was no resentment, just confusion, because the numbers didn't lie. German prisoners under armed watch were eating more calories per day than American civilians during rationing. More fat, more meat, more variety, more flavor. This was the math that hurt. Not bombs. Calories, not losses on the battlefield, but gains on the plate. Every meal in captivity reminded the German PS of what they had lost. Not just control of the war, but control of the story. The myth that they were the superior civilization, the stronger nation, the better people. All of that was challenged by beef sizzling on a Texas grill. Many couldn't reconcile it. Some refused to eat at first, believing the food was drugged. Others ate slowly, eyes wide, chewing as if waiting for someone to slap the plate away. The few wept openly, not from hunger, but from shame. The burger wasn't just meat. It was a message. You are not starving here. You are not less than us. You are not what you were told. One P wrote, "I fought for an idea, but the meal made me doubt if I had ever understood what that idea truly meant." The sun was high and dry over the Texas sky, the kind that cracked soil and soaked into skin. It was a Sunday afternoon in late summer, and on a cattle ranch just beyond the wire perimeter of AP work detail, something unexpected was happening. The rancher, a stocky man in his 50s with sun-worn hands, looked out at the 10 German prisoners who'd been hauling hay for 2 weeks straight. They didn't speak much English, but they worked hard, didn't complain, and had even fixed a broken fence faster than his own hired help. So, he decided to do something no one told him to do. He fired up the grill. His wife mixed ground beef with salt, pepper, and a little Worcestershire sauce. His daughter sliced tomatoes, laid out pickles, and tore lettuce into palm-sized pieces. They had loaves of fresh white buns from the town bakery and enough potatoes to fry up batches in lard. The smell alone could make a man forget where he was. The prisoners saw the smoke first, then the sound. The sharp sizzle of fat on metal unmistakable. They turned toward it, eyes narrowing, not sure if they were dreaming. Then they saw the rancher wave them over. Of the guards hesitated. "Sir, they're not supposed to eat off property," he said. The rancher just shook his head. "They've earned a damn burger." A long table was set up in the shade of an old oak tree. The prisoners approached slowly, unsure. When the first burger was handed over, thick patty, melted cheese, toasted bun. One reached for it. It just sat in the man's hands like a relic. He stared at it, then looked up at the rancher, then down again, and then his eyes welled. "I can't," he whispered in German. Another prisoner stepped forward and asked, "Is this real meat?" The rancher smiled. "Son, that's Texas beef. The best you'll ever taste." Eventually, one took a bite, then another. Then the table turned quiet, except for the soft crunch of fried potatoes and the chewing of disbelief. One guard later recalled, "You'd think we handed them gold. But what made it matter wasn't just the taste. It was what it represented. This was not standard rations, not military issue. Stew. This was homemade family-cooked food served hot by civilians in peace. It wasn't about the calories. It was about the contradiction. They had been taught that Americans were uncultured, cruel, racially inferior, spiritually corrupt. And yet here they were being fed like neighbors. One prisoner asked if he could help clean up afterward. Another said he wanted to write a thank you note, though he didn't know how to spell in English. A few asked if this meal meant the war was over. It didn't. Not yet. But something was over. Something that had lived inside their heads. A wall built of lies and slogans and fear began to crack one bite at a time. That night, back in the camp, the men didn't talk about military orders or escape plans. They talked about mustard, about ketchup, about whether it was okay to enjoy what they were given. One man confessed to another, "I was afraid it was poisoned, but it was just food. Just food, but not just anything. That burger meant memory. It meant a smell they wouldn't forget. It meant Texas wasn't what they'd been told. And if Texas wasn't, maybe the rest of America wasn't either." In war, the moment of collapse rarely comes with a blast. Sometimes it comes with beef, bread, and a stranger saying, "You've earned it." The collapse didn't begin with hunger. It began with too much. After the hamburger meal, some prisoners returned to their barracks in silence. A few joked nervously, trying to turn the moment into something ordinary. But the rest just sat still. One P later said, "It felt like I'd stepped off a map. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't a prisoner. I didn't know what I was anymore." They had prepared themselves for captivity, for punishment, for mistreatment. And yet here they were, fed well, spoken to gently, handed food with both hands. No shouting, no beatings, no denial of dignity. The numbers didn't line up. The story they'd been told was fracturing. In training, they were shown images of American cruelty, black and white films of executions, propaganda cartoons, stories of starvation camps. They were told the Americans were weak but heartless, primitive yet dangerous. A German soldier captured by the enemy was expected to suffer. That suffering would confirm his loyalty and the brutality of the other side. But Texas didn't cooperate. One soldier recounted how, after eating the hamburger, he couldn't sleep for 2 nights, not because of fear, but because of doubt. He had dreamed of Berlin, of family, of fighting for something righteous. But now, thousands of miles from that mission, a rancher had handed him a plate of food and smiled. The enemy had become human, and that was the problem. The math had changed. Before it was simple, us versus them. Now it was us and them. And maybe not so different after all. Even the guards felt it. Watched the prisoners shift. Eyes became quieter. Posture softened. One wrote in a letter, "They seem more tired after a good meal than after a workday, like their brains are working harder than their hands." Some PS tried to reject the idea outright. It's manipulation. They're softening us up. But others weren't so sure. If it's a trap. One whispered, "Why does it feel like home?" One of the military chaplain who visited the camp noted a sharp increase in PS requesting time to pray alone. They weren't praying for freedom. They were praying for clarity. The psychological collapse wasn't about physical survival. It was about narrative survival. And that's harder to measure, but more devastating when it fails. The hamburger was never just beef and bread. It was proof that their enemy could be merciful, that captivity could offer dignity, that hate could be met with something terrifyingly close to grace. One diary line found decades later, scribbled in pencil, read, "Thought surrender meant death, but the burger made me question what we truly lost." The man's name was Roy Chambers, and his land stretched 37 acres beyond the tree in outside Mexia, Texas. He had grown up under sun, barbed wire, and church bells. By 1944, 2 of his sons were overseas with the 36th Infantry Division. His third boy was still in school. Roy stayed back to manage the ranch, raise cattle, and survive the war the best way he could by feeding America. But he didn't expect he'd be feeding Germans too. The government sent letters asking ranchers to accept labor from the nearby P camp. The war had drained the local workforce. Mahias young men were in France or the Pacific. Roy didn't ask many questions. He needed hands. The men arrived in trucks watched by U.S. guards, 10 of them all German.